When honor met arrogance, the royal guard's salute that silenced even the most arrogant bully. In the heart of England's capital city, where modern life hums beside grand, ancient buildings, there stands a place filled with pride, tradition, and respect: Buckingham Palace. Every year, millions of tourists from around the world gather outside its black and gold gates to watch a tradition that has stood the test of time: the changing of the guard. It's not just a performance. It's a living symbol of history, honor, and the quiet discipline of the soldiers who serve there. The Queen's Royal Guard is no ordinary military group. Clad in bright red uniforms with tall black hats called bearskins, they are a picture of order and control. These soldiers are not just standing around. They are highly trained professionals, many of whom have served in difficult roles in different parts of the world. They know the meaning of service, and they carry their duties with quiet pride. Among these guards was Sergeant Jonathan Price, a man in his late 30s with a face that held both strength and kindness. His eyes, calm but alert, watched everything, even though he rarely moved. He had served in the army for nearly 15 years and had earned respect from both his fellow soldiers and his superiors. He wasn't someone who needed to shout or show off to be noticed. His discipline, patience, and quiet courage spoke louder than words. Jonathan came from a small town in the countryside, where his father had been a postman and his mother worked in a local school. From a young age, he had been drawn to order and responsibility. While other children played, he would arrange his books neatly or line up his toy soldiers with care. When he joined the army at 18, he found purpose in structure, and over the years he grew into a soldier who understood not just how to follow commands, but how to lead by example. Standing guard at Buckingham Palace was one of the most honorable duties a soldier like Jonathan could receive. It wasn't about glamour or fame, it was about representing the spirit of the country. The job required stillness, attention, and above all, self-control. Guards like Jonathan were not allowed to react to distractions. Tourists could laugh, wave, or even try to get their attention, but the rules were clear. No response, no expression, and definitely no emotion. It was a test of patience and professionalism. Most tourists respected this. They admired the guards and took photos with smiles, staying at a respectful distance. But every now and then, someone would cross the line. Someone would forget that these were real soldiers and not statues for amusement. That day, someone did. His name was Darren Coyle, a man in his 20s who had become popular on social media for his over-the-top videos and flashy lifestyle. Darren wasn't a bad person deep down, but fame had changed him. He had found success by recording pranks, silly stunts, and public challenges that often pushed boundaries. With a large following online, he felt pressure to constantly create new content, and that meant being louder, bolder, and more shocking with every new video. Darren's content wasn't always mean, but it had started to get more irritating. He would walk into public places and ask people strange questions, sneak up behind them to scare them, or make jokes at their expense. Most of the time, people just laughed it off. Sometimes they didn't, but Darren didn't worry too much about that. His videos were getting views, and in his world, views were everything. One morning, Darren arrived at Buckingham Palace with a small camera crew and a big plan. He had decided that he was going to make the guards laugh. His goal? To get one of the famously serious royal guards to smile or react, and catch it all on camera for his next viral hit. He wore a bright, flashy suit and carried a microphone, pretending to be a reporter. His crew set up across the palace fence, and the crowd started to notice something was happening. Some people pulled out their phones, thinking they might see something funny. Others looked uncomfortable, sensing that something didn't feel right. But Darren was already walking toward the guard on duty. That guard was Sergeant Jonathan Price. Darren approached with a wide grin and stood just inches away from the soldier, whose eyes remained straight ahead. Jonathan didn't move. He didn't blink. His hands were perfectly still, resting on the rifle that was part of his ceremonial uniform. The sun reflected off the polished buttons of his red coat, and the white straps across his chest were spotless. He looked like part of the building itself, unmoved, calm, eternal. But Darren was just getting started. He waved his hands in Jonathan's face, no response. He made silly faces, even danced around, still nothing. Then he started talking. "Hey man, do you ever smile? Blink once for yes, twice for no," he joked, leaning in. "Come on, just a little smirk. I bet you laugh in your sleep." People in the crowd began to murmur. Some chuckled nervously, unsure if they should laugh. Others turned away, embarrassed for Darren. A few tried to signal him to stop. But Darren, lost in his own show, didn't notice. Or maybe he did and didn't care. He moved closer. "Is it hot in there?" he continued, knocking gently on the bearskin hat. "Hello, anybody home?" Jonathan remained motionless, but inside he was aware, fully aware. Not just of Darren, but of the growing crowd, of the cameras, of the responsibility on his shoulders. He wasn't angry. He had seen things like this before, but he also knew that sometimes silence spoke louder than anything else. Darren, now clearly not getting the reaction he wanted, decided to go further. He turned to the camera and said, "This guy's got the personality of a lamppost. Maybe if I salute him, he'll finally show some respect." He stood stiffly and threw a mock salute at Jonathan, sloppy and exaggerated. Then he burst into laughter, as did one of his camera crew members. It was meant to be funny, but it didn't land that way. In that moment, something in the air changed. The crowd was silent. Not because of shock or excitement, but because they felt something, a kind of quiet disappointment. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It felt wrong, like a line had been crossed, not a loud, dramatic moment, just a soft realization that the joke wasn't funny anymore. But Jonathan still didn't move, because Sergeant Price understood something that Darren didn't, not yet at least. He understood that respect doesn't rise to the level of mockery, it stands above it. And sometimes the best response isn't action, but patience. Across the crowd, a few older tourists shook their heads. A man in a wheelchair, wearing an old military jacket, watched carefully. He was a veteran himself. His face was quiet, but his eyes carried the weight of understanding. He had worn a uniform once, too. He knew what it meant to serve and to be seen not as a person, but as part of something greater. And that's how the stage was set. A decorated soldier who had given his life to honor and discipline. A young man lost in the noise of fame. A crowd unsure whether they were watching a joke or something deeper. And a moment, just one moment, waiting to change everything. Darren had always been someone who believed he was in control. His jokes, his videos, his audience, everything was part of a carefully designed plan to keep his popularity rising. When one prank worked, he'd plan the next, trying to top himself. In his world, nothing seemed serious. Everything was a game, and everyone around him was just part of the stage. But as he stood in front of Sergeant Jonathan Price, surrounded by a growing crowd, something felt different. The usual laughter wasn't there. The lightness he expected from the audience had turned into uncomfortable silence. He didn't notice it at first, or maybe he chose to ignore it. His focus was still on getting a reaction, which to him meant anything but stillness. He tried again. "Do you ever get bored just standing there?" Darren asked, walking slowly around Jonathan. "Or is this your favorite statue pose?" Jonathan didn't flinch, not even a blink. His face, strong and calm, remained forward. The wind tugged slightly at the end of his red coat, but he didn't move with it. His hands stayed fixed on his ceremonial rifle, his body as still as the palace behind him. Darren turned toward the camera crew, pretending to hold back laughter. "Guys, I think he's stuck. We might need to reboot him." Some people in the crowd chuckled quietly, but it wasn't the joyful kind of laughter Darren was used to. It was nervous, awkward, the kind of sound people make when they're not sure if they're allowed to say something. The kind of sound that fills the air when something doesn't feel right. But Darren didn't stop. He felt the pressure to keep going. The camera was rolling, and in his mind that meant the show had to continue. "Come on, mate," he said again, now speaking louder. "You're getting paid to do this, right? At least give us a little entertainment. Do a spin, a little twirl. I'll even dance with you." He began twirling in front of Jonathan, arms stretched out like a child pretending to be a ballerina. His bright outfit flared as he spun, and his hair blew in the wind. It might have looked silly and playful to some, but to most watching it felt out of place, like a comedy act at the wrong time in the wrong place. An older couple standing nearby exchanged glances. The woman whispered something to her husband and gently pulled her young granddaughter closer. Another man, wearing a cap that said "Retired Navy," folded his arms and watched Darren with an expression that was more sad than angry. Still, Darren didn't see it. Or maybe he didn't want to. He thought the guard's silence meant victory, that he had somehow won by getting so close without being stopped. But what Darren didn't realize was that this wasn't a game with winners and losers. It wasn't about who laughed last or who got the most views. It was about something else, something he hadn't yet understood. The camera crew, though loyal to Darren, began to shift nervously. One of them, Josh, who had been filming Darren's videos since the early days, lowered his camera for a moment. "Maybe that's enough," Josh mumbled, unsure if Darren would hear him. But Darren wasn't ready to stop. He was caught in the moment, the feeling of being watched, the idea of going viral again. He couldn't turn back now, not with all those people waiting to see what would happen next. He raised his hand again and gave another mock salute, this time more dramatic. Then, for the first time, he stepped forward just a little too close. He didn't touch the guard, not yet, but his fingers came within inches of Jonathan's uniform. It was a tiny movement, but one that broke an invisible rule. A line that most people instinctively respected, even if they didn't fully understand it. To everyone else, the air felt different. He had gone from being silly to being rude, and even though no one shouted or pointed, the mood in the crowd changed completely. And yet Jonathan didn't move. He had faced harder tests than this. He had stood still in the middle of heat waves, heavy rain, and long hours without rest. He had remained calm during crowded state visits, protests, and all kinds of noise. What Darren was doing wasn't the hardest thing he had faced, but it was definitely one of the most disappointing. Because Jonathan believed in something deeply. He believed that the uniform he wore meant something. That when he stood in front of the palace, he wasn't just a man, he was part of a tradition that stretched back hundreds of years. He stood for dignity, for respect, for quiet strength. He knew that if he reacted, it would no longer be about those values. It would become part of a joke, something to be shared, commented on, and forgotten in a few days. So he remained still, not because he was weak, but because he was strong enough to be still when it mattered most. Across the street, someone else was watching closely. An older man, sitting quietly in a wheelchair, had been there since before Darren arrived. He wore a simple green jacket with a few military medals pinned to the chest. His hands, weathered and steady, rested on the arms of the chair. His eyes were sharp, filled with memory and understanding. He had served long ago, in a time when the world was different, but honor still meant something. Watching Jonathan reminded him of the men he had served with, men who didn't need to raise their voices to earn respect. Men who stood for something bigger than themselves. He didn't speak, he didn't interrupt, but his presence was strong, like a quiet anchor in the middle of the storm. Darren, still unaware, looked around and saw the cameras still rolling. He smiled again and walked a little farther, this time passing behind Jonathan. "That's it," he whispered to himself. "One last move." With a playful grin, Darren slowly reached his hand out, not to hurt, not to grab, just to lightly tap the guard's shoulder. He thought it would be harmless, just a touch, enough to maybe break the silence, enough to finally get a reaction. But just before he did, something stopped him. Not a hand, not a word, not even a sound. It was the eyes of the crowd. For the first time, Darren really looked at them. Not just the camera lens, not just the tourists holding up phones, but the actual people. Their expressions weren't amused. They weren't impressed. Some looked away, others stared with quiet disappointment. And one pair of eyes, the eyes of the veteran in the wheelchair, met Darren's directly. There was no anger in them, no blame, just a kind of quiet question. "Why?" It hit Darren harder than he expected. Suddenly, the fun he thought he was having didn't feel like fun anymore. The joke didn't seem funny, the lights of fame didn't seem as bright. For a second, he lowered his hand. Just then, the bells from the nearby church chimed softly in the distance. A group of schoolchildren walked by with their teachers, pausing to watch. One of the little boys waved at Jonathan, who, of course, didn't wave back. But the boy's smile didn't fade. He just looked up at the guard with wonder, eyes wide with admiration. Darren watched it happen. And for the first time that day, he felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Respect. Not the kind that comes with applause or online likes, but the kind that comes when you realize someone else is doing something truly meaningful and you're not. The kind that doesn't need to be shouted. It just exists quietly with weight. He stepped back. The camera crew looked at him, confused, but Darren just gave a small shake of his head. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Something inside him had shifted, even if he didn't fully understand it yet. The crowd remained silent, and Jonathan, still as stone, continued to do what he had always done, stand with honor. The moment wasn't over yet. But something important had already begun. Darren stood in front of the royal guard, his mind slowly catching up with the moment. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure what to do next. The camera was still rolling, his friends were still watching, and the crowd hadn't moved, but something inside him had changed. Just a few minutes ago, everything had felt like a performance. Now it felt real. He glanced around. The crowd was still quiet. No one was clapping or cheering. A few people held their phones low. One girl in the front row had stopped filming altogether. She just stood there looking at him, not with anger, not even with judgment, but with a sort of quiet disappointment that felt heavier than any words. Darren didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to silence. In his world, silence meant the show had failed, but before he could speak or act again, something unexpected happened. Sergeant Jonathan Price moved, just one step. It was slow, steady, and deliberate. He didn't rush, didn't startle. He simply took one single step forward, lifting his polished black boots off the stone path with perfect control, then setting them down in front of him with care. His back remained straight, his grip on the ceremonial rifle firm. The crowd held its breath. Darren took a small step back, surprised, not scared, but surprised. He hadn't expected the guard to move at all. For a moment, his thoughts raced. Was he in trouble? Had he crossed some official line? But Jonathan didn't speak. He didn't point. He didn't scold. He simply raised his right hand, and then slowly he brought it to his forehead in a perfect salute. Darren's eyes widened, but the salute wasn't for him. Jonathan's head turned slightly, not much, just enough to make it clear. His eyes, hidden in the shadow of his bearskin hat, were focused on someone else in the crowd. They were locked on the man in the wheelchair, the older gentleman with the military jacket and faded medals, a veteran. The crowd followed Jonathan's gaze and turned to look at the seated man. For a moment, time seemed to pause. The veteran sat still, his face unreadable. Then, after a few quiet seconds, he lifted one trembling hand to return the salute. His hand wasn't as straight. His movements weren't as sharp, but the meaning behind them was just as powerful. It was a moment of respect, one man honoring another, a soldier recognizing someone who had come before him, and the crowd, silent only moments ago, began to clap. It wasn't loud or rushed. It started with just one or two people, then more joined in. Gentle applause filled the space in front of the palace. It wasn't for a show, it wasn't for a joke, it was for something real. Darren didn't clap at first. He just stood there, frozen. He looked at the veteran again. Then at Jonathan, then at the people around him whose faces had softened. He felt something in his chest, a kind of heaviness, but not in a painful way. It was the feeling of seeing something true, something that didn't need editing, sound effects, or comments to be meaningful. The camera was still rolling, but for the first time in his life, Darren didn't care. Jonathan slowly lowered his salute, returned to his original position, and stood tall once again, eyes forward, still as ever. But something had shifted. Not just for Darren, not just for the crowd, but for the moment itself. Darren took a deep breath and turned to Josh, his main cameraman. "Stop filming," he whispered. Josh hesitated. "Are you sure?" "Yeah," Darren said quietly. "We're done." Josh nodded and lowered the camera. Darren didn't feel embarrassed. He didn't feel like he had lost. What he felt was something new, something unfamiliar, a kind of quiet admiration, not just for Jonathan, but for what he stood for the discipline, the control, the respect. He turned back to the veteran and took a few steps in his direction. The man looked up at him calmly. "I didn't mean to be disrespectful," Darren said, his voice soft. The veteran gave a small nod. "You learned something today," he said, not unkindly. "That's more than most." Darren didn't know what to say to that, but the words stayed with him. He looked at the man's medals, dull with age but full of meaning. He thought about the life behind them, the stories, the sacrifices, and suddenly all of his online jokes and stunts felt very small. He stepped back and gave a respectful nod to the man before turning and walking away slowly. The crowd parted to let him through. No one stopped him, no one booed or cheered. They just let him go. He passed by tourists, families, and a few children who looked up at him curiously. One little girl pointed at him and asked her mother, "Is that the man who was being silly?" Her mother smiled gently. "He was, but I think he's thinking now." Darren heard it, and instead of feeling hurt, he felt grateful. Sometimes truth came from the simplest voices. He didn't look back. Behind him, Jonathan remained in place, tall and silent once more. The moment had passed, but its meaning remained in the air. People continued to take pictures and admire the guard, but they did so with new eyes, with more understanding, with more respect. Back on the street, Darren sat down on a nearby bench, his team joining him quietly. For a few minutes, no one said anything. Finally, Josh spoke. "So, what now? Do we post any of it?" Darren shook his head. "No, this one's not for views." He didn't say much else. He just looked up at the palace, where the sun was now casting golden light on the upper windows, and he let the silence fill him. It wasn't just the guard who had taught him something that day. It was the pause, the stillness, the honor that doesn't need to shout to be heard. That single salute had spoken louder than all the pranks he'd ever filmed, and he would never forget it. Darren didn't say much for the rest of the afternoon. The usual spark in his voice was gone, replaced by something quieter. He still walked with his team, still smiled politely when someone recognized him, but he wasn't the same. Something had changed inside him, something real. Later that day, Darren and his crew returned to the small flat they had rented in the city. Normally, after filming, they would celebrate. They would laugh about the best moments, pick which clips to post, and talk about how many likes or comments they might get. But this time, the energy in the room was different. No one rushed to upload the footage. No one cracked jokes or replayed the scenes. The moment with the royal guard had been powerful, and it still echoed in their minds. Josh sat down on the couch, holding the memory card. "So, what are we really doing with this?" he asked gently. Darren didn't answer right away. He stood near the window, looking out at the city lights. Cars passed by, and people walked along the streets below, busy with their own lives. He thought about how often he had been focused only on himself, how he measured his day in views and comments. But today, something different had mattered. He turned and looked at his team. "We're not posting it," he said simply. "Not even a clip." Josh looked surprised but nodded. "Okay. I mean it," Darren said. "It wasn't a joke. That moment, it was about something bigger than us." The team didn't argue. Deep down, they agreed. They had seen it too, the weight of the salute, the quiet respect between the guard and the veteran. It wasn't something to turn into content. It deserved more than that. That night, Darren sat alone with his laptop. He scrolled through old videos, ones where he had pranked strangers in grocery stores, asked silly questions in restaurants, and done stunts in public parks. He had millions of views. People had laughed. He had gained fans, followers, sponsors. But looking at those videos now, they felt different. He remembered how he had once surprised a man reading quietly on a bench by shouting behind him. The man had dropped his book, clearly startled. At the time, Darren had laughed and walked away. But now he wondered what that man had felt. Was he just embarrassed? Had Darren ruined his day? Had he even thought about that? He closed the laptop. The next morning, Darren woke up early. He didn't plan to film. He didn't plan to go live or post a new challenge. Instead, he decided to walk. No phone in his hand. No camera following him. Just a quiet walk through the city. He passed by shops opening for the day, cafes serving warm breakfast, and people hurrying to work. No one paid much attention to him. And for once, Darren liked it that way. He walked toward the park, a peaceful place with large trees, benches, and a small pond where ducks floated gently across the water. There were a few joggers and parents pushing strollers, but it wasn't crowded. And then, as he sat on a bench under a tree, he saw someone familiar, the same elderly man in the wheelchair from the day before. He was sitting near the edge of the pond, watching the ducks with a calm expression. He wore the same green jacket, the medals still pinned neatly on the chest. His hands rested on his lap, and his eyes, though aged, were sharp and aware. Darren felt nervous as he walked over. He wasn't sure if he would be welcome. But he felt something inside telling him it was the right thing to do. "Good morning," Darren said softly. The man turned his head slowly and looked at him. His expression didn't change much, but there was no anger in his eyes. "Mind if I sit?" Darren asked, pointing to the empty bench beside him. The veteran gave a small nod. Darren sat down. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. They just sat quietly, watching the ducks glide over the water. Finally, Darren spoke. "I didn't come to explain or to defend myself," he said. I've been thinking a lot since yesterday." The older man listened, his face calm. "I thought I was just making people laugh," Darren continued. "That's how it started, at least. But somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking about how other people felt. I just wanted attention. I forgot that real respect means understanding people, not turning them into entertainment." The veteran didn't interrupt. He waited until Darren had finished speaking. Then he said, "Most people don't realize the power of stillness, of silence. You learned that yesterday." Darren nodded. "I did." The veteran smiled faintly. "That guard you mocked, he represents more than just a job. He stands for those who have given their lives for something greater. He reminds people that dignity doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just stands tall." "I see that now," Darren said quietly. "And I'm sorry," the man gave a slow nod. "It takes strength to admit that." Darren sat back, letting the breeze brush past his face. Birds chirped in the distance, and the sun shone through the branches above. It was peaceful, and in that peace Darren felt something healing. "May I ask your name?" Darren asked. "Walter," the man replied. "Walter Briggs. Mr. Briggs, thank you for yesterday and for today." Walter looked at him with kind eyes. "You're welcome." After a while, Darren stood up. He didn't take a photo. He didn't record the moment. He simply said goodbye and walked away, feeling lighter. Over the next few days, Darren began to make changes. He stopped making prank videos. He didn't announce it with a long post or a dramatic goodbye. He just quietly removed a few old videos and started thinking about what kind of stories he wanted to tell. He still had a camera. He still had a voice. But now he wanted to use it differently. Instead of filming jokes, he started filming stories of everyday people, a woman who ran a small bakery and gave free bread to those in need, a retired teacher who tutored children for free, a group of teenagers who cleaned up the local park on weekends. He called the series Quiet Heroes. At first, not everyone understood the change. Some fans asked where the pranks had gone, but others started to see the heart in Darren's new content. The views didn't skyrocket like before, but Darren didn't mind. Every message that said, "This inspired me," or "Thank you for sharing this," meant more to him than any number. One afternoon, he received a letter in the mail. It had no return address. Inside was a single card. It read, "Real strength doesn't need to shout. Keep standing tall. WB." Darren smiled and placed the card on his desk. The salute from the Royal Guard had been a turning point, a silent moment that spoke louder than words. It reminded him, and many others, that honor is not always loud, but it is always powerful. And in that quiet transformation, Darren found something far more lasting than fame. He found purpose. Months passed, and the world continued to move as it always did: busy streets, endless scrolling on phones, new trends rising and falling every week. But in one quiet corner of that world, a change had taken root, slow but steady, in the life of a young man named Darren Coyle. Darren wasn't chasing likes anymore. He wasn't pulling pranks or rushing to be the loudest voice in the room. Something in him had shifted, not in a dramatic way, but in the kind of way that sticks. The kind of change that comes not from embarrassment, but from understanding, from reflection. The day at Buckingham Palace was no longer just a memory. It had become a mirror. Every now and then, Darren would walk past the palace gates, not with a camera, not with a crowd, but alone, just to stand there for a few minutes and think. He never tried to speak to the guards again. He didn't need to. He had already learned what they were teaching just by standing there in silence. His new video series, Quiet Heroes, slowly started gaining attention, not because it was exciting or dramatic, but because it was genuine. Each video was a simple story: a gardener who volunteered at a retirement home, a young woman who taught music to children for free, an elderly man who mended old bicycles and gave them to kids who couldn't afford one. Darren wasn't the center of attention in these videos. He was the storyteller, not the star, and that felt right. People began to notice the change, especially those who had followed him for a long time. Some were surprised, others were inspired. His comment sections, once filled with laughing emojis and silly jokes, now had words like, "Thank you for this. I cried watching this. I want to do something good too." One message in particular stayed with Darren. It was from a young teenager who had written, "I used to think I had to be funny to be important, but your videos made me realize that kindness matters more." Darren saved that message in a folder on his computer. On days when he felt unsure or tired, he would open that folder and read it again. He still remembered the salute, not just the movement of the hand, but the meaning behind it. It had been more than a gesture. It had been a reminder, a call to be better. One chilly morning, Darren decided to visit a small community center not far from the park where he had once spoken with Mr. Walter Briggs, the veteran in the wheelchair. The center hosted events for local seniors, offered meals to those in need, and even ran storytelling nights. Darren had heard they were looking for volunteers. When he arrived, he wasn't treated like a celebrity. He didn't mention his name or his past. He just introduced himself as Darren and asked how he could help. They asked him to carry boxes, sweep the floor, and later assist with setting up chairs for a poetry reading. He did it all with a quiet smile. Later that evening, as the room filled with warm lights and soft voices, Darren noticed someone at the back of the room. Mr. Briggs. He hadn't seen him in weeks, and yet here he was, seated near a window, his medals shining gently in the light, his hands folded neatly in his lap. Darren walked over and greeted him. "Mr. Briggs," he said warmly, "it's good to see you again." Walter looked up and smiled. "You've been busy," he said. Darren nodded. "Trying to stay useful." "That's a good thing to try," Walter replied. They sat in silence for a few moments, listening to an elderly woman read a poem about autumn leaves and memories of childhood. Her voice was soft but steady. "You know," Walter said after a pause, "most people chase the loud moments, the cheers, the applause, the lights, but the things that stay with us, they're usually quiet." Darren looked at him. "Like a salute," Walter smiled, eyes twinkling. "Exactly." Darren thought about that moment again, the single step, the slow raise of the hand, the quiet reply from a fellow soldier. It was one of the few times in his life where no words had been needed, where silence had said everything. As the event ended and people began to leave, Walter reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. He handed it to Darren. "I've been meaning to give you this," he said. Darren looked at the envelope. It had his name on the front, written in careful handwriting. He opened it slowly. Inside was a letter. It read, "Darren, you may not remember everything you've said or done in life, but others will. And sometimes the way you carry yourself in a single moment can leave a memory in someone's heart forever. That day you listened. You changed, and you honored something important. Keep walking that path, not for views, not for praise, but because it's the right thing to do, with respect." Walter gave him a nod. "Take care, son." That night, Darren didn't post anything on social media. He didn't record a vlog or write a caption. He just walked home in the quiet evening air, thinking about how far he'd come, not in miles, but in understanding. And the next morning, when he woke up, he began working on his next story. It was about a retired nurse who baked bread every weekend and gave it to homeless shelters. No flashy music, no silly voiceovers, just a simple story of someone doing something kind. And that was enough. Years later, Darren would still get recognized sometimes. But people didn't call him the prank guy anymore. They called him the storyteller. And many of them would say, "I loved the salute story," or "That video with the guard, that's what made me start following you." Some even told him they had joined the military, become volunteers, or started helping in their communities. Not because they were told to, but because they had felt something in that moment. Something honest, something good. And so, long after the applause had faded, and the cameras had stopped rolling, that single silent salute continued to live on, not in loud echoes, but in small choices, in changed hearts, in quiet kindness. Because in the end, when honor met arrogance, it didn't fight back. It simply stood tall, saluted with dignity, and walked away having taught a lesson that would never be forgotten.